I see it.
Okay, and also what you can do is, as an organizer, you can share a link where someone else can start the recording. So a volunteer can pull up a link and have that same window that I clicked on, and they can start the recording. So it's pretty low lift. So that's why we're doing it. And I thought, because this was a meetup on accessibility, might as well try it out, right? So accessible media, and I'm going to ask if you still just see the presentation. Do you see the presentation screen? Okay, good.
Yep.
Because I got a new computer recently, and you know how that goes. It's like, oh, what can go wrong? I have a meetup to do tomorrow. So accessible media. I am AmyJune, for those that didn't meet me when I was in Iowa a couple of years ago. I now work for Canopy Studios. I am their community person. So I do meetups, I do talks, I help organize camps. I do a lot of just community work in general. DrupalCorn has a place in my heart because it was the first time I ever gave a contributions workshop, which was really exciting because now that's something I do at almost every camp in DrupalCon. So that's really nice. And I'm always really grateful that I had that experience in Iowa. And then I work for the community health working group. I am a hospice nurse by trade. So accessibility is super important to me because when I moved into tech a couple years ago and found out that people could build accessible websites, but didn't, it was just this like weird thing for me to think about. And I thought, okay, I found my niche. Because being a hospice nurse and working in geriatrics and people who have brain dysfunctions and stuff like that, I really saw how some people can struggle with, cell phones and media and just simple email tasks. I work for Canopy. So we're going to talk a little tiny bit about what accessibility is, because I do have some slides in here about the terms and definitions, but I'm just going to kind of gloss through those. But really the meat of it is about images, not forms, I took forms out, but slideshows, videos, media players, a little bit about social media, because all of us, especially if we have organizations that have marketing, are on social media these days. And then if I have time, I'll demo some accessibility testing tools that are free, because I really like free software. So to really understand what accessibility is, you have to understand what it means, right, to embrace it. So today I'm going to talk about producing rich, engaging media that's accessible to everyone. So this is an inclusion talk as well, if you want to look at it from a different point of view. Temple Grandin, she's a great autistic spokesperson. She works for the Colorado State University. And I love this quote, I'm different, not less, because differences aren't quantifiable, right? That just really speaks to me. So from a stakeholder point of view or a product owner, why do we design for accessibility? The obvious reason is that it's the law, right? But really, we want to include a wider consumer base for our content, not just like product buyers, but knowledge-based information as well. We don't want to exclude people from using our products and services. So accessibility is really essential for developers and organizations that want those high quality tools, because the CDC says that 26% of Americans live with some form of disability. That's roughly 1 in 70 million people. And if you think about just the context of North America, 26%, those numbers are even larger, outside of North America. And we got to remember, when we get older, everyone becomes a little bit less abled, right? Our hearing, our eyesight deteriorate over time. And then there's things like situational disabilities, where, once I had a broken arm, so I was unable to like really function, like drive my car, when we talk about accessibility of mobility, or when I was on the BART, to use a cell phone efficiently or use my laptop without captioning, and you think about, other instances like the mom on the bus who's holding her baby. You can be recovering from eye surgery. You could have just had LASIK. And a situation disability might be going out into the sun and having the sunlight be too bright against whatever screen you're using. And not every disability can be seen. So it's something to think about when you design your personas and who uses your website. There's debilitating pain, there's migraines, there's dizziness, there's learning differences, mental health disorders, as well as the hearing and vision that a lot of people just think about. In 2016, WebAIM ran an automated testing on web pages from 62 large universities, and that included something from each US state or territory to search for just the really common errors. And they found 78% of those web pages had obvious errors. And by 2016, that figure had decreased, but there's tons of room for improvement. And the reason why I wanted to focus on universities because their accessibility standards are more stringent because they get money from the federal government. And so they have to abide by certain rules and restrictions. And then accessibility means everyone. Really, it means everyone can access the information you're offering. And that includes written content. And it's important to know that inclusion is not giving special privileges to some people. It's making sure that those barriers aren't there in the first place. Who are you? You're everyone, right? Bloggers, marketers, trendsetters, communicators. And like I said, I'm just going to kind of breeze through these terms and definitions, but these might be words that you hear sometimes. There's the ADA, which is the American Disabilities Act. And I like to point this one out because it prohibits the discrimination with people with disabilities, that we have to provide them with the same opportunities as everyone else to enjoy employment opportunities. And that's the important part. We're Drupal developers or WordPress developers or whatever, we're working in our CMSs. So the ADA is about the front facing as well as the back facing, making sure that your admins can use your interface and that your admin UI is accessible as well. Section 508 requires federal agencies to develop, procure, maintain, and use information that's accessible to people who live with disabilities. And this goes beyond just government workers. And to be 508 compliant means you're WCAG compliant. And there's this acronym we sometimes hear called POUR. It's the high level principles. And the first one is perceivable. It means that the user can identify content and interface elements by means of the senses. Operable. This makes sure that the user interface and components and navigations can be operable, interactive elements. It means making sure the functionality is available through a keyboard. Another example might be giving users enough time to read and use the content, not using content that causes seizures or physical reaction like vision-induced motion sickness, VIMS. Making sure your users can navigate and find content in a consistent manner, and making sure that there's ways beyond the keyboard to enter content. Understandable, making sure that the information and the operation of the interface is understandable. So you make your text readable and understandable. And some of this is iterations, but making sure your content appears and operates in predictable ways. That's important for some users too, because it really helps them avoid and correct mistakes that they can do from page to page. Robust. That really has to do with the technology that people use. We want to make sure that it can be used by an array of the user agents, including all of the assistive technology devices. We want to make sure that our websites are compatible with the tools that people have now and that future user tools too, always looking forward. And WCAG is the Web Content Accessibility Guideline. And it's a guideline so there can be like a single shared standard for accessibility standards, and it meets the needs of individuals, organizations, and governments internationally. And there's 3 levels. There's the A, the AA, and the AAA. And the standard right now is to reach that AA level. That's what most universities and 508 compliance goes to, is that AA level. And it's used for, content developers, page authors, site designers, the people who are authoring the tools, the people who are evaluating the tools. And really the WCAG standards are for anyone who just needs that standard, you know, a set of rules to go by. Assistive technology is a device, software, or equipment that helps people work around challenges so they learn, communicate, and function the same as everyone else. So screen readers, speech input devices, pointers, keyboards, all of those are examples of assistive technology. And I want to be sure that folks are aware that a mobile phone can be considered an assistive technology as well. So when you design responsively, keep that in mind, that all of the tools that people need to use to communicate their needs on the desktop also need to kind of follow through on that cell phone as well. So to break it down, basically there's visual needs, you make it easy to see. There's motor needs, you want to make sure that people can interact with your products and content, so you accommodate motor needs. You want to make it easy to hear, so you accommodate auditory needs. And then you want to make it easy to understand, so you accommodate cognitive needs as well. You want to make sure that the experience for everyone is as equivalent as possible, regardless of things we can't control, like what desktop they're on or whether or not they have a mouse. What's a screen reader? Simply put, screen readers take the text on the page and convert it into speech. This technology is really important because it really empowers users who live with low vision, or let's say cognitive and learning disabilities, to access the information and be able to maintain a level of privacy too. Because think about it, if you don't have a screen reader and you want your email, you're relying on a caregiver to read the email, and there might be something in there that you don't want them to know about. So it really, the screen reader removes that barrier to the internet or digital information for folks. And there was a survey that said 87% of people that use a screen reader because they live with a disability. So that's 14% of other people who just use a screen reader just because. And of those 87%, 71% rely on the audio alone. So when we think about screen readers, let's think about what they do for our website. The screen reader really navigates by using the tables and lists, buttons, forms, images, widgets, anything that appears on your website. So developers who want to know how the content sounds on screen readers should work with native users on a regular basis. So they learn how to use, so they really understand how a native user uses the screen reader themselves, because a native user uses it much differently than a sighted person. So when we think about screen readers, we want to make sure that we have landmarks on our pages, and page regions are declared using HTML5, semantic HTML. And if we don't have any semantic HTML markup, then we go and use ARIA landmarks. We want to provide our users that use a screen reader the ability to skip over repetitive navigation links. So having a skip to main content link at the top of your page. This is default by Drupal, so you actually have to turn that off with Drupal. So that's kind of a nice out of the box feature. And then when we think about our links and form controls, we want to make sure that the links and the controls make sense when they're read out of context, making sure that they're labeled so the users know that that's what they're on. And images, we love images. They not only enhance our content, especially for people who live with cognitive or learning disabilities, but we include images in media to support and add to our information and our concepts. And some folks who live with low vision use the images on the screen as cues to help orient themselves on the page too. But from a stakeholder point of view, media, including images, including social media, we use images for conversion rates. Having images on our posts lead to higher click-through rates and return on our investments. If you have a Twitter ad that has an image versus one that doesn't, the one with the image is going to have a higher click-through rate than the other one. And images can really be major barriers when they're not accessible. So from an overall point of view, when images are accessible, they benefit not only people using screen readers, because that can be alternative read aloud and also rendered as Braille, but people using speech input software, you know, they can put the focus onto a button or a linked image on the page with a single voice command. The text alternative can be read aloud for people browsing speech-enabled websites. Mobile web users, you know, images can sometimes be turned off, especially if you have data roaming or people who have poor internet connections. And then think about it from a search engine optimization standpoint. Once you have an image turned to text, you know, with the alternative text, those images become indexable by search engines. So to have accessible stuff, it also means having SEO-friendly stuff. So images, there's all different types of images. There's the simple image, there's a complex image, and I'm going to go through these in a second. There's decorative images that are purely decorative but not informative. There's images of text. There's groups of images where the text alternative for one image should convey the information for the whole group. There's image maps, you know, an image that can contain multiple clickable areas. So let's look at the simple image. This is a Volkswagen. You know, I love Volkswagen, so I thought I'd go with that theme today. Images that convey simple information can be described with alternative text or alt text in short speak. And alt text is a short, sweet, concise description of the content of the image. And typically it's invisible for folks who can see the image, but it's exposed to people who are using assistive technologies such as Braille displays or screen readers, or folks that have the images turned off in their browser. So the description should really convey the content and the functionality of the image as sweet and concise as possible to provide access to the content of the image without adding a ton of details. And then complex images, you know, these can be graphs, they can be charts, they can be diagrams. They really contain too much information to be effectively described using that short, sweet alternative text. So instead, we want to make sure that we provide people in our WYSIWYGs or in our user interfaces the ability to add long descriptions to these. This is HTML5 markup. So a long description is a more detailed description that provides equivalent information. You know, the question to ask yourself with images, especially complex images, is given the current context, what information is this image intended to communicate? Because that same information must be provided to people who can't see the image. You know, and a long description can include any structure necessary to communicate the content of the image as well. You know, if it's a graph, you know, including headings and lists and data tables too. Decorative images, these, and I have my own feeling about these that isn't shared with everyone. But if an image is purely decorative, and this is what some people say, and does not convey any meaning, there are a couple of ways you can tell screen readers to ignore the image, and that's fine. For like images that are decorative, like for borders or spacers or corners, illustrative of text but not contributing information. You know, it's identified by or described by the surrounding context of text. But this is something I like to say is if you have a decorative image that conveys and evokes emotion, why not describe that in your alternative text? If it adds value to your page, the people who can't see that image are missing out on that mood or experience. So that's my take on decorative images. You're using it for a reason. So if it's important enough to include for your sighted users, it might be important enough to be able to provide that context for your users using the alt text as well. There's images of text. That's where the readable text is sometimes presented within the image itself. If the image is a logo, that's okay, don't worry about it. But we really want to avoid text and images. However, if we do use images of text, we want to make sure that that alternative contains these same words as the image. But be mindful when you use images of text, because Actual text is more flexible, right? It can be resized without losing clarity, and background and text colors can be modified to suit the reading preferences of the users, whereas images of text can become distorted when people zoom in. So that's why it's really important to make sure that your alternative text contains the same text as in the image. You know, there's groups of images. If multiple images, because like in this picture, they're all separate star ratings, they're all separate images. If it conveys a single piece of information, the text alternative for one of the images should convey the information for the rest of the group. So using this as an example, you know, this group of 5 stars shows this product rating. So say the 5 images, 3 are filled in, and then there's the 1/4 star indicating the overall rating. The text alternative might read rating 3.25 out of 5 stars. And then all the other images would be left empty or have that null, you know, quote on there. In image maps, an image map, you know, we're familiar with these on Google Maps, perhaps. Image maps contain multiple clickable areas. This can include organizational charts, park maps, decision trees. The text alternative for an image that contains these multiple clickable areas should provide an overall context for the set of links. So we also want to make sure that each individually clickable area should have alternative text that describes the purpose or the destination of the link. So say you're hovering over the link to the Volkswagen store in San Mateo. You want to make sure that that link says Volkswagen store of San Mateo, and the one in Redwood City would say Volkswagen store of Redwood City. So we want to make sure that that the links are distinguishable. So what are some other common uses for images? We often use links, images as links, including pagination and anchor links. We can use images for logos, or they can be decorative. Images can improve usability by giving orientation and interactive elements that are easy to recognize and use. But we do want to be careful when we use alternative attributes for image links, because the alt attribute has 2 requirements. It must describe the image itself and then tell the user what activating the link will do. So I'm going to say that again. When we're using alt attributes for image links, it has 2 requirements. It must describe the image itself and also tell the user where the link is taking them. And context is super important. So you want to be sure you're accurate and equivalent in presenting the same content and function of the image. Again, be succinct. Typically no more than a few words are necessary, though you could have a short sentence or 2 that could be appropriate. Be mindful of using phrases like image of or graphic of to describe the image, because people who are using that alternative text are probably already aware that they're on the image. So imagine a screen reader going through, and a screen reader announces where it is on the page. So a screen reader will say image of, and if someone has included that in their alt text as well, it's very redundant. So it'll say image of a Volkswagen on the beach. So be mindful of that. So don't be redundant. Also, if there's enough context around the image, you don't have to include that in your alt text. But to kind of make it simple to think about, and an easy way to sort of test yourselves whether or not you're providing enough context is, if you turn off images, is all your information still being able to be presented to your folks? So if you turn off your images and if you turn off your CSS, do you have the same user experience as you did when they were on? Slideshows. Some folks really like slideshows. Most of the time they're predominantly located on our websites, and they're used to provide things like navigation and show page content. A slideshow displays a few items at a time. They're known as carousels or sliders, and typical uses of slideshow could include maybe something like a scrolling news headline or featured articles on homepages and image galleries. But I have on here, you know, the first rule of slideshows is not to use slideshows. And this is coming from the W3 schools. They say that slideshows from a usability perspective, not just accessibility, but just from a usability perspective, they're hard because their content can be hard to discover. So ensuring accessibility can also improve the usability of your site. Back to accessibility is good for everybody. So let's look at some slideshows. So how do we make slideshows more accessible? We can style the carousel to make sure it's usable and readable, making sure if we use animation, transition animations between items, that the user has the ability to stop and resume them. We want to make sure that we provide the ability to turn off the player. And along those lines is we want to make sure that those visual controls are accessible to the keyboard, mouse, and touch. And then we want to be sure that those controls can be seen, making sure that our when we tab through using the keyboard, that our controls are highlighted on focus, and then making sure that there's no keyboard traps. So if you can get into the slideshow, make sure, like if you tab into a slideshow, make sure that there's an escape out of the slideshow too. That's what a keyboard trap is. And back to the controls. You can see in this picture, one of the controls, I have hovered on the right-hand side, but the left control is very non-visible. So we want to make sure that those controls are visible. So remember size and color, and really think about and take into account the background color can change on those images. So maybe having a background behind those arrows will help with that visibility. So it goes back to that, making sure that you have sufficient color contrast, and size and color, being important. We want to make sure that there's a reasonable alternative to that slideshow. The slideshow does not need to function when the styles are turned off, but all of the content needs to be available. And again, like images, can you turn off the images and still be able to relay all of your information? If your CSS and JavaScript is turned off, is your content provided in a way that makes sense and is predictable for folks? And I want to talk a little bit about moving parts of a website. This is a little bit generic, but having content that blinks for more than 5 seconds can be distracting for certain groups, including people with low literacy or reading levels, or folks that have intellectual disabilities, and people with attention deficit disorders. Content that blinks can be difficult or impossible to interact with the rest of the web page. So I don't have things on autoplay because I don't like to use them, but this is a picture of a Volkswagen in the background. All the little matrix stuff sort of goes back and forth. Autoplay on a website, I recommend not having an autoplay, but I'm not the only stakeholder in the world. So if you do have something on autoplay on your website, providing a method to pause, stop, or hide the content that begins automatically. And this WCAG standard applies to anything that autoplays that for more than 5 seconds. So if it's under 5 seconds, you can get away with autoplay. But if it's longer than that, you must provide a mechanism for turning it off. So let's think about the moving parts. Content that moves or auto updates can be a barrier to anyone who has trouble reading stationary text efficiently. But we also, there's people who have trouble tracking moving objects, and this can also be problematic for screen readers. So there's things like form notices, a form that might blink an arrow near a submit button if a user finishes filling out the form but does not activate the submit button. That blinking needs to stop after 5 seconds. Those animated loading wheels that we use, that preloader animation that's shown on a page, that requires a certain percentage of a large file to be downloaded before playback can begin. That can be super distracted for our users. There's advertisements on the web. An advertisement on your page could blink to get viewers' attention, but make sure that it stops after 5 seconds. And then we have tickers, the news tickers or the stock tickers that we see on some websites, providing an ability to to stop that ticker and have it act like a slideshow where the consumer can click through it using a button. So those are all moving parts to think about on your website. And let's look at videos, because we love videos, right? Some people learn better by watching a video rather than text-based. So sometimes we use them in our tutorials. But how are people consuming the video? How are you consuming the video? And then how is your audience consuming your video? So those are two different things to look at. Captions, like alt tags for our images, captions are text versions of the audio content, and they're typically synchronized with the video. I talked a little bit about before I started the transcriptions here. Captions just sort of happen as the person's talking, or there's noises being made, but drop off the screen after a few seconds. There are tons of situations that can benefit from captions. There's loud environments like at the airport or a noisy co-working space where we can't hear the audio. I haven't been in one of those for a long time, but I'm assuming it's still true. But then there's silent environments like the quiet co-working space where you can't turn on the sound. And then sometimes content can be better understood by people hearing and seeing the information. For example, people who aren't native speakers of the language that the video is in. And for some folks, it's easier and just quicker to read through than to watch the videos. And the content becomes now text, right? So now it's indexable by your search engines again. And YouTube provides automated captioning most of the time for folks. And that's a good first start, but there's something to say about going back and correcting those and making sure your captions are accurate. It's kind of tricky, but there's a lot of tutorials out there on the web on how to go back and fix your closed captioning. Captions should also include other content, other audio content that's happening. You can see in this picture, the caption is music. But you know, anything that's adding value to your media, you know, dogs barking, music playing, saying there's eerie music so people know that there's something spooky coming up, you know, lightning flashing. And then even if the words to the song are conveying some emotion, include those as well. Captions can be either open or closed. Closed captions, when you look at a video, you can turn them on or off, whereas open captions are always visible. Open captions allow for more control over where the captions are, you know, the location on your screen, the size, the color, the font, and the timing, but they can't be edited after the fact. So closed captions are most common, utilizing the functionality of all of our video players and browsers. And then audio descriptions, they're separate narrative audio tracks that describe any sort of important visual content, making it accessible to people who are unable to watch your video. If the visual content is being conveyed through audio, then there's no need for audio descriptions. And transcripts, you know, that's what we see going in our external window. It's the text version of the media content. You know, a transcript, well, the one I'm playing now just is recording my words, but they can also be edited later to include any on-screen text or descriptions of key visual informations. And they really provide an important part of making that multimedia content accessible. They allow anyone that cannot access the content from web or video to read the transcript instead. And they don't always have to be word for word. They could contain additional descriptions, comments, or explanations that can be beneficial. You know, things like the indications of laughter or the explosion, things that we talked about. And then transcripts also allow assistive technology to use refreshable Braille and other devices. So transcripts really help our users that are using the assistive technology. And again, they allow the content to be indexable by our search engines. So media players, choosing an accessible media player. We all have certain requirements we have when we choose a media player. So you really have to weigh all your different options. There's a lot to choose from. especially on mobile devices, you know, recommending an app for folks, making sure that because there's 100 different YouTube apps, and some of them will provide captioning and some of them won't. So be very mindful of third-party embeds that you do on your site. So when choosing how to deliver your video, it's important to consider the accessibility options. Does the media player support closed captions? Does the media player support audio description in a way that enables our content consumers to toggle the narration on and off? Can the media player's buttons and controls be operable without a mouse? You know, our user agents, you know, like tabbing and switch devices and things like that. Are the media buttons and controls properly labeled so that they can be operated by a blind person or someone using a screen reader? And is the media player fully functional, including all of the accessibility features across all the different platforms and all the major browsers? And I know as developers, we kind of give Internet Explorer a hard time, but the fact of Internet Explorer is JAWS, the #1 screen reader that people use for assistive technology, for screen reading, most users use Internet Explorer for that. So that's something to keep in mind, because I hear a lot of developers be like, it's only Internet Explorer, but you're losing a large audience when you don't include Internet Explorer in your testing. And time-based media. This one's kind of weird. I'm a concert goer. I love live music. Unfortunately, these days, you know, we don't have that. But back when we could go buy tickets, Ticketmaster is kind of our only choice, right? But it always has this time limit. And you're waiting because, you know, Grateful Dead tickets are going to go on sale, or Bad Religion tickets are going to go on sale at 10 a.m. And you're waiting and you're waiting and you're first in line and you're filling out all the information and you're there and you have 2 minutes, and darn it, your wallet is downstairs and you have to run downstairs and be able to come back and make sure that you enter your credit card information in 2 minutes. Well, think about someone who has like a palsy or a tremor, a hand tremor, and it takes them longer to input information. So if possible, your elements should not be subject to that time limit. You know, allow users to use the media at their own pace. And if there is a time limit, for security reasons, we should be able to have the option to turn it off or extend it, because you're still using it, right? And by law, because I do mention law versus the right thing to do, but by law, the restriction doesn't apply if the time limit is due to those live concert events or those, you know, live events like auctions or gaming, or if the time is to fill the form might be essential for a valid form submission like a CAPTCHA and things like that. So I want to talk a little tiny bit about social media. WebAIM, I referenced this same survey earlier in the discussion. But they talked about screen readers, and 88% who use a screen reader also use it on a mobile phone or handheld device. And only 54% of people found social media somewhat accessible. So think about who's using, what devices people are using these days. You know, how many of your content consumers are only on social media? They aren't visiting your desktop site anymore. So in 2019, 200 colleges faced civil rights queries on whether or not their social media was accessible and could clearly communicate to people who live with disabilities. And the results weren't good because social media isn't going away, you know, so we want to make sure that our social media for our digital goods and services are accessible just as well as our desktop. So let's take a look at hashtags, images, and links. We want to make sure excuse me. We want to make sure, I'm tickled. We want to make sure we use capital letters to break up the words in our hashtag, like my name, AmyJune, capital A, capital J, all title case. It comes down to readability. And remember that Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook and all of the other things that I don't know about, they don't distinguish between the cases when people are searching for the hashtags. For example, this one displayed on the screen, I love Twitter, with the capital I, capital L, capital T. And then if you can imagine that all in lowercase, I love Twitter, when you search for either one of those are going to come up for the same results. So having said that, if your hashtag is just one word or is relatively short, then all lowercase is perfectly fine. I want to talk a little bit about images in social media. You know, the same rules should apply to images in social media that they do on your desktop sites. They should be captioned or described. And many of the social media platforms have settings that allow users to use this. Even some of our scheduling platforms like Hootsuite and Buffer. But you do, unfortunately, have to dig into those preferences to find that. Some of them are a little bit more obvious these days, but you can add alt text and tagging your images and things like that. Links should be described as well when you're in social media and given some kind of context. And then, of course, be mindful of retweeting information that's not accessible. And this is my favorite example of that non-camel case hashtag. So back a few years ago, there was this question of, you know, people thinking Cher had died, but it was really Margaret Thatcher. So no capitalization in that hashtag really caused that confusion and tweet storm, right? So it's a couple of extra keystrokes, but think about how we all use those long hashtags these days, and how, think about combination of words. If you divide the combination differently, sometimes you'll find things that are offensive. So be very mindful of that. And then who doesn't love to throw in an emoticon? Some people really love them, but you know who really loves emoticons is screen readers, because they will read every single one of them. So think about your tweet where every other word is an emoticon. Your screen reader is going to be reading, hey, picture of sunshine, hey, you know, picture of the moon, did you, picture of the beach. So it can be very cumbersome. So if you do use emoticons and hashtags, saving them to the end of your social media content benefits everyone. But we also have to think about all the different places we have emoticons, right? We have them in our Slack profiles. We use them in our Slack messages. We put them in our handles. We put them in our subject lines of emails. So be very, I will just invite everyone to turn on their voiceover and read some of these and see what it sounds like to you. Because if they're cumbersome, your content consumer may leave your tweet before they even get to the end. So that's something to think about. So now what? Communicating is important. You know, maybe you're not the stakeholder, but now you have some empathy, right? What you can do to implement accessibility from the beginning is setting up style guides and style sheets, using pattern libraries. So developers and designers are in the site and we build the site, and at some point we hand them off to somebody else, the stakeholder, the content consumer, or the content author, the content editor. And we have to be mindful of how they use our websites too, because you can have the most accessible code in the world, but when your content creators go in there and use a WYSIWYG and all of a sudden start using headings for styles, or changing the font size and doing all sorts of weird things, we have to think about that when we build our website. So we want to make sure when we build WYSIWYGs or editors that we have tooltips and that we train our content editors on how to use them too. Because if we're trained as designers and coders, then it makes sense to train those content creators, because they're in there far longer than we are. You know, they're in there for the long haul. Making sure we use accessible fonts and color contrast on our site, and limiting our fonts and color contrast on the site. And then something to be aware of too, that accessibility is really a moving target. Just because your site is compliant today doesn't mean that it will be tomorrow, especially after content is added. And there's new standards coming up in the future too. So it's always something to think about. I recommend, as a site owner, doing a quick accessibility gut check every 6 months or so, just to make sure, because maybe it's content entry and you can like do a little bit of a discussion and a how-to with your group on, you know, how to enter content and keep it be accessible. And there are lots of tools for accessibility testing. My favorite is the Site Improve browser extension. It's free. It's really handy. There's the Totally browser extension, that's TOTA11Y. Of course, keyboard navigation is super important. Just going onto your website, fresh reload, and hitting that tab key and seeing that, you know, your content flows easy. Can you skip your menus? Can you see where you are on the page? The Wave tool is used by folks who assess higher ed institutions. So if you're working for a higher ed, test using the Wave tool, because that's what a lot of the auditors are using. There's the Axe tool and the Lighthouse tool. Those are in your inspector elements. And then you can utilize color contrast analyzers as well. And that's what I had to say. I can, or at like 10:53, I can have you folks ask questions, or I can do a demo of some tools real quick. It's really up to you folks how you want to spend the last few minutes.